From its first European settlement in 1788 by a small contingent of the First Fleet, Norfolk Island has been home to sustainable farms and gardens. Now, this is sustainability that's pragmatic, it's born out of necessity, partially because of the island's limited range of natural resources, but also because of its geographic isolation. It's over 1,000 kilometres from the nearest landfall. This means that imports have always been difficult and expensive. Many islanders are starting to appreciate the significance of this sustainability, and a number of them are now taking it to the next level, applying organics and other principles to their projects and their growing. I was lucky enough to catch up with a few of them in what I think I'm going to have to call the barefoot interviews. Pete Barney is a gardener with a very focused goal. He established and manages these kitchen gardens to provide the cleanest, tastiest and freshest produce to the kitchens of Hilly Restaurant. So Pete, beautiful gardens for the restaurant. Tell me a little about how they came about.
Well, we started about 3 years ago. Just started growing for the restaurant, just a couple of herb beds around the back of the restaurant. And of course, chefs being chefs, they just completely took everything down to the ground. So Kim, the owner of the property, said we could move up in larger ground and redo veggie gardens up here. So started with a small little patch and just kept on growing and growing and growing. And now we've got about 3/4 of an acre, which is wholly and solely for the restaurant, doing about 250 covers a week. We provide 75% of the produce that goes back in the back of the restaurant. It comes out of this garden, so pretty intensive. But the main thing is we're growing, flavours for the chefs.
You largely do grow organically and absolutely sustainably. So tell me a little about how that came about.
So, well, that was a bit of re-education. I come from a commercial background, and I learned how to grow things big and fast and heavy and that kind of thing for the market, whereas to come and then work closely with the chef and they're asking things about flavour, I had to go back to the books, really look at where flavour came from, and that was from the soil and how I needed to balance that soil, get away from that chemicals, try and increase nutrition levels in the plant, and by doing that the benefit was I was getting greater flavours.
I think the interesting thing too, and that's something that people forget, is that flavour is nutrition. The reason plants have flavour is because of the fact that they have the appropriate level of the appropriate nutrients, and of course they're picked at the right stage of their life cycle.
Well, of course we are growing seasonally. That dictates what the flavours have got at that time of year. But by increasing the nutrition levels in the plants, you're increasing that flavour. You're also getting other benefits too. You are also getting better bug protection. Caterpillars can't handle the sugars. They've got no pancreas and liver. They die of alcohol poisoning because your nutrition levels are too high. Things like your shelf life, because they're fatter plants with more nutrition when you pick them, they've got a longer time sitting on the shelf. So the chefs, they got a better product that 2 days later, still just as good to use. So you get other benefits too by trying to increase those nutrition levels within the plant.
Obviously you and chef are doing a lot of forward planning as to what the menus are going to be, and in many respects it would involve the chef having to start to think very differently about how he's menu planning.
And that's the joy for me in the garden. It's, I'm looking at on general rule of thumb, I'm looking at 3 months for crops. Chefs are looking at an 8-week cycle of menus. So you got those 2 time frames. You got to now sit down and start working out forward planning on what they think is going to be coming on, and then it's about quantities. So then it puts it back on the chefs. They now have to work with the boom and bust of a garden, having the gluts and working out what they're going to do because they've got too much. Oh dear, this week we've got too little of this. How am I going to change my menu? And that is the chef's skill. Nothing's at the drop of a hat. They can't just go down the supermarket and get this. They have to work with the palette they've got in that garden. The thing I can guarantee them is that they're going to have full flavour in that produce. Throughout the year we grow 52 different varieties within the garden, so that's quite a lot for the chefs to keep playing.
When you started the gardens, as you said, they were pretty much from scratch. What sort of process did you go through to get things underway?
My first step was soil test. Get the soil test, then you know exactly where you're at and where you're starting from. That pretty much told me what I needed to get into that soil to start balancing. So it's all about balance. Once you balance that soil underneath the plants, It's for the plants to do their job. They know how to grow, they know how to get that nutrition out of the soil. You just got to provide the perfect mix underneath them to uptake that nutrition, which ultimately becomes the flavour in the plants.
Sustainability on the island tends to be a very pragmatic type of sustainability because of the island's isolation.
Yeah, we are a little dot in the middle of the ocean, and everything's got a freight component. Everything's got to come on a ship and be offloaded on the jetty. So straight away, your fertiliser costs go through the roof. And to do that on an ongoing basis, we can't do that. It's just the end product becomes too expensive. So it really is looking at what we have, how we can use that. And we've got beautiful young soil being a volcanic island, and there's plenty of nutrition underneath there to feed this island for a very long time. Within the restaurant, we recycle all waste that's coming out of that kitchen. Gets composted, goes back into the ground. We're putting these inputs back into the ground. That's our free fertiliser. Now you've already paid for it, you know.
Yes, yeah.
And it's about recycling those minimal resources.
And I love your chook shed. Is one of the best chook sheds I've ever seen, and it's sort of like an accelerated composting unit. Well,
the chefs are always, they get through trays and trays of eggs. We've got something that's being chucked away out the back of the restaurant, which is the scraps. I have a lot of leaf litter and that on the property. All goes into the composting bays. The chickens eat the food, they scratch, it's what they naturally do, so they're turning my compost for me. So we get the eggs out of it, and then ultimately I get the compost to go back into that soil, which is just invaluable to me, just purely because of our water situation on the island. We rely on everything that drops out of the sky. So I need good organic matter underneath that plant, which is my water retention, which is my sponge, and so it's really critical to me that I have that.
And it's all naturally manure enriched as well.
Exactly.
Chooks.
Yes.
If you had a couple of tips for people that were looking at doing a bit more home veggie gardening themselves, what would your big tips be for them?
Compost.
Compost.
Everything comes back to that compost. If you can start in that corner of the garden, a little compost heap, going through all your kitchen scraps, getting all that all those offcuts of the carrots and all that going, and getting that recycled, your garden will bloom.
Awesome. Thank you, Pete.
Not a worry.
Cheers, mate. Matt Figg is a commercial market gardener. His crops go into the local restaurants and supermarkets, and he sells directly to the public from the weekly growers markets. Matt Figg, organic farmer. Tell me a little bit about your journey towards organics and organic farming.
I've always sort of farmed and grown our own fruit, vegetables and meat and milk our own cows, and so I basically have just done that as a hobby, and we've always been that way sustainable. So I just basically went a little bit further and went a bit commercial. Organic farming, or low chemical use, biological farming, call it what you want. That's how we farm. My philosophy is, if I'm not going to feed it to my children, then why should I feed it to other people's children in the way of chemical farming? I just can't bring myself to do it. Over the years, many years ago, we've had to survive here on Norfolk Island. It's an isolated place, and it was a long time between ships, so food source had to come off the land. So within our race of people that have lived here since we first migrated from Pitcairn Island, we've had to learn how to be sustainable and utilise the land for food and live off the land. We farm probably about 10 acres, roughly. We're what you would call small croppers, so we grow whatever can grow in season, because it's all seasonally produced.
You've made that conscious decision to shift towards organic methods. How did you find that sort of pathway? Did you encounter difficulties?
I found it pretty easy because I've always done it, and it wasn't until a few years ago that we were introduced into biological methods and the science behind it, and to actually enhance on that, and to actually realise why you do farm like that, and the science behind it. And it's an absolute no-brainer. It's all about the soil. It's a biological city underneath the surface of the soil. Getting what you put in the soil, it's bringing it out into the fruit, into the plants, getting a healthy plant. If the flavour's there, then your sugar levels are up and it's being grown properly. You know, that old saying, you are what you eat. Now, if you look after your body, your immune system's going to be pretty good. It's the same with the plant. You look after a plant, its immune system's going to be good, its defence system against pests and diseases. They say organic farming is alternative farming. As a matter of fact, it's not. It's chemical farming or farming those newer methods is alternative farming. It's just one big science experiment.
The island is full of a lot of multi-generational farmers. You must have met at times a bit of scepticism when you
definitely
said, I'm going towards the organics.
Yeah.
They're very much the conventional style of farming.
It's pretty hard to turn a farmer around that's been doing something for a number of years, but as soon as they get big results and they get big crops, there is a big movement nowadays and a lot more education on why we should farm that way, and there's a lot of people that are turning to that, and which credit to everybody. I'm happy doing what I do, and I feel better about selling something. That's the sort of mindset that I have, and I think it rubs off on a few people, the customers, and they don't mind the odd thing that doesn't look 100%. It's not made for shelf. It's made for the consumption and high quality food that you're going to eat and get something out of.
I've seen how fast your produce sells out on market day.
Yeah.
If you're not there early, it's gone. And so it's obviously there is the demand for it there. People are definitely wanting that product that's lower in chemicals and that's higher in nutritional content. Have you got a couple of tips for people that are thinking about swinging towards more organic and sustainable home growing?
Yep. Get a soil test.
Yep.
Really important. Get a soil test, see what your soil's missing, and build on that, and try to move away from nitrate fertilisers. There's a lot of companies out there now that are dealing with biological fertilisers. Do it. It's an absolute must. Mulching is a huge way to get your soils good. It brings the worms back up. Your plants will be healthy, and you'll end up not having to spray because your soil is healthy, your plants are healthy, everything's healthy. You're healthy.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt.
No worries.
When Mitchell Graham decided to establish a veggie garden at the family home, doing things organically just seemed to happen logically and naturally. So Mitch Graham, this is your beautiful little home veggie garden here. Tell me a little bit about how you came to be doing what you're doing and largely organically.
I've always had an affinity to the garden. I've always wanted to be able to feed myself, be sustainable in that way. I love the concept of recycling everything from your own property. And so from that I've tried to put together a garden that feeds us as well as recycles all the waste that we have from the kitchen and also anything else that's organic. So I can mulch it up. I have a chipper that I can then use to put everything together and go back into the garden. So from that I just slowly put together a little garden, which I'm enjoying.
You apply organic principles to the way you are growing everything?
Best that I understand organics. I'm by no means any expert. If you consider mulching a garden and trying to put everything that's friendly into the garden as organic, then I'm organic. So yeah, I guess I could say I follow organic principles. The first thing I actually grew, because I love them, is watermelons. My wife's father, he came and ploughed up a little bit of a patch for me, and that was the first beginnings of the garden. Again, using the chipper, I was able to chip up palm fronds to use as mulch, and then use cardboard to recycle to help minimise weed impact on the garden. And then from that it's grown into the veggies and more fruit, tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchinis and carrots and beetroot and kale, and so slowly getting ourselves fed.
And I notice you use cardboard a lot as sort of like a blanket mulch.
It's awesome. I find it a fantastic thing to save me weeding time. Yeah, it breaks down really well. Whenever you move the cardboard or pick it up, there's always a good amount of worms that are living under there. So it serves a twofold purpose. Provides food to the worms and the biology in the soil, and it keeps the weeds away, and it makes my job a little bit easier, which is good.
How do you find pests and disease problems? How do you cope with those sort of things?
I don't have a lot of problems with the pests and disease. The vegetable sides of things, with lettuces and tomatoes and zucchinis and that, they're doing fairly well. Keeping the plants healthy certainly helps to serve in minimising the impact of those things. If I do get those things, then I can always help stimulate the plant's immune system with the likes of kelp and things like those, which like to trigger off a good immune response in the plant. So with all those tools, I keep on top of it.
You have conducted reasonably extensive testing on your soil to get an understanding of what exactly is there to start with, or has it been a bit of trial and error in that respect?
Yeah, to begin with I had a soil test done. I sent that away to the laboratories, and then they sent the test back to Nutritech, and their agronomist then had a look at it and came back with a recommendation, what amendments I could utilise in the soil to help balance the soil out, and then what foliar sprays would work really well to help address any problems. And that's working really well. I bring all my seeds in at this point from diggers in Australia, because I love the concept of heirloom seeds. That way I can continue to save the heirloom seeds, and over time they can acclimatise well to our environment, then also pass them on to anybody else that wishes to grow them on the island. And I know they're seeds that are not modified genetically in any way, in that I think they have a lot more goodness within that plant because they still have their full natural gene makeup that nature intended for them to have. And
have you got some tips that people could use if they're looking at getting a garden going and want to go organic?
start out small.
Yeah.
Start out small, something that's manageable, something that you won't lose inspiration over because it's gotten too big for you and you feel like you can't handle it. I quite often recommend to my friends who want to get into gardening and into the organic way of things is start out with a patch that you can access easily from all sides. If you have the means of lightly turn it with a pitchfork, great. If you don't, then just get yourself plenty of mulch, some greens and browns, if you get your hand on some manures, some mulch, and then mix it in, put it on the soil and let the worms and everything else do the job for you. That biology then builds up, the worms increase, and the food that they'll start to get out of that small little plot will be awesome, and you'll find that they will find that they can get a lot more produce from that small area by giving it a good healthy start than by going too big and not being able to do everything they need to do for it because it overwhelms them. So,
We'll have a look through the garden.
Let's go.
Thanks, Mitch.
We'll see what happens.
Derek Greenwood has a very different mission: to regenerate degraded native bushland and bring back rare species. He's using a few permaculture principles in this work. Derek Greenwood, thank you. Tell me a little bit about the projects that you're working on.
The project that we've spent a lot of time on is a bush rehabilitation project. The property is about 8 acres in area. Roughly 6 acres of that would be bush regeneration that we're working on. It's a combination of degraded bushland as well as some land that was semi-cleared and just remnant, say Norfolk pines had been left, but with subsequent invasion by woody weed species. Some of the undisturbed areas of forest have also been invaded just naturally by woody weed species.
You're using a lot of what people consider as permaculture type of principles in this regeneration. Can you tell me a little about that?
Okay, well, permaculture follows sort of 3 main ethics, as you may be aware, which is care of the earth and care of people, and then the third one is the return of surplus to the other 2.
I suppose a surplus that you have in many respects when you're doing this work is you have green material coming out of the revegetation areas. You're reusing that.
Yeah, that's right. One of the principles of permaculture, and there are several sort of principles which will guide the design of a system that you're working in, is using everything at its highest value. Now, in this rehabilitation project that we're working on, we've got a large volume of woody weeds, and the highest value for using those in that situation is to convert them all into wood chips, and that wood chip can then be used to enrich the plantings. You're saving moisture, water, by the mulching. You're suppressing the weed, and those woody weeds, as wood chip, they're slowly being converted back to an organic fertiliser, just a slow release organic fertiliser. Where there are logs that are too big for either of the machines, I cut them into rings like pavers, and I use them for what I call water catchers or rain catchers by placing them on the uphill side of a newly planted native seedling, and that in effect becomes a roof, so that when it does rain, the water runs off that piece of timber and is directed down towards the loose soil where you've just planted your native tree. There's quite a few of the native species that will regenerate on their own just by removal of the woody weeds. Things like cordyline will self-seed very easily because birds are spreading seeds of those throughout the forest where they fly. And Norfolk pines, they periodically have a very big seed production years when there are literally millions of seeds of the pine that are produced and drop down through the canopy onto the forest floor, and so you get massive germination of pines in those particular fruitful years. The idea is to plant as wider diversity of native species as you can, because the more complex you make the ecosystem, the more stable it is as well. It's able to withstand shocks such as unusual droughts or unusual wet years. It's important that if you've got the choice, always try and plant at the best time of the year for planting, where you get the greatest survival rate, just because you're exploiting the softness of that climate at that particular time of the year. There are many natural symbiotic relationships between the different plants and the animal species that inhabit the soil that we're not even really aware of, but by creating as great a diversity as possible, we're allowing those symbiotic relationships to develop and enhance the recovery of your rainforest plants.
Have you got a few ideas and tips for people?
Use your woody weeds as mulch. Try and start on an area where you know that you can maintain it. Don't bite off more than you can chew. We need to respect the soil from a biological sense as well as the physical sense by retaining its structure as much as possible.
Excellent, thank you.
And Derek's work certainly seems to get the seal of approval from this white tern and her chick who are nesting in the regeneration area. So there you have it, just a tiny taste of sustainability and organics, Norfolk Island style.